every gilded cornice in this castle was paid for with slave labor. Until 1799, the Scottish miners who dug for its wealth were slaves, not metaphorically, legally. They were sold along with the mine. Women hauled coal on all fours. Children, from the age of 5, worked in total darkness. The elegance of this place was born in hell. Today, this castle is worth over 100 million, but that's not the most horrifying part. It wasn't built by a medieval tyrant, but by an educated lawyer, a man of the Enlightenment. And now, you will learn exactly how a brilliant architect turned the despair of children into one of the most famous staircases in the world, and what deal its creator made to be remembered as a hero and not as a monster. Look, there it is. A perfect facade carved from honey-colored sandstone and framed by leaden clouds. It doesn't stand on the cliff. It clings to it, like a bird of prey to its quarry, 150 feet above the fury of the Irish Sea. Its name is Culzean. Tourists call this place a fairy tale. They come here by the thousands, their voices just a temporary whisper on the wind. They see the flawless lawns, manicured with mathematical precision. They admire the towers and battlements, a theatrical set designed to convince the world of the ancient lineage of a family that was, in fact, young and hungry. This is a theater where the same performance of perfection is staged daily for hundreds of tourists whose cameras greedily devour the light but remain blind to the shadows, which are thicker here than the sea fog. But it is a lie. A perfect, polished lie that you pay for at the entrance. You only need to wait for the last bus to leave, when the castle is left alone with its only true neighbor, the sea. That's when it begins to breathe. The walls inhale the salt air, and a cold rises from within that has nothing to do with the weather. The locals know. They tell of the piper, of a ghost who appears on the cliff's edge when a storm is brewing. They say his music isn't a melody, but the piercing cry of the land itself, a lament for something that was taken by force. They hear him in the gusts of wind, in the creak of old weather vanes. He doesn't play for the living. He plays for the waves, which for centuries have been trying to reclaim this stone for their abyss. Let's go inside. The air here is still. It smells of cold wax, withered flowers, and a faint hint of salt seeping through the stone. Footsteps echo loudly on the parquet floor, polished to a mirror shine. Every step you take is an intrusion. Here, the silence isn't empty. It's oppressive. It's filled with the weight of hundreds of rooms where no one lives. Fingers slide along the mahogany banister. It's cold. It remembers only the hands of servants and tourists, not the warmth of a family. Look at these enormous panoramic windows. The architect wanted to let in the light and majesty of nature, but he let in a monster, the eternally restless, gray, hungry sea. It looks into every room. It is the main occupant of this house. Its hoarse voice never falls silent, a reminder of the deal struck with the rock, a deal that will one day have to be paid. This castle is watching. It sees you through the empty sockets of its windows. Its flawless beauty is a mask. Beneath it lies not a story of triumph, but a record of a crime. Here, every room is a page in an indictment. Every gilded detail is a piece of evidence. So what is this? The final triumph of human will over the elements? Or the most expensive mausoleum in Scottish history, built long before the death of its one true master? Is this a house built for living, or a tomb carved from vanity, standing on cursed ground? To find the answer, we must go down, not into the castle's cellars, but into the mines, to the place where its black, Coal gold was born. Where does the money for a dream come from? Not the kind born in the heart, but the kind carved from stone so that it might outlive its creator. The answer is rarely beautiful. It smells of damp earth and fear. To understand Culzean, you have to forget its walls and look at the land it stands on. In the 18th century, this land supported hundreds of families, tenant farmers. They had lived here for centuries, their connection to these hills deeper than the roots of heather. But the new owner, David Kennedy, the 10th Earl of Cassillis, didn't see people. He saw a resource. He saw potential profit. He was a lawyer. His weapon wasn't steel, but parchment. His battlefield wasn't the hillside, but the courtroom. He spoke of agricultural improvements, a beautiful, clean phrase from the age of Enlightenment. But behind it hid a process as cold as a blade: enclosure, eviction. It was a slow, legally flawless war, where paragraphs of law were used instead of cannons, and eviction notices nailed to cottage doors served as bayonets. Imagine the silence that falls after the people whose ancestors are buried beneath these stones have gone. Imagine the smoke from their extinguished hearths. On this devastated land, Kennedy raised sheep and leased plots to large-scale farmers. The rent increased fivefold. The foundation of the castle was laid. But that wasn't enough. The gold for the gilded cornices and Italian marble had to be extracted from the darkness, literally. Beneath these green hills, in the damp, eternal night, lay the Kennedy family's coal mines. And this is where the language of law ends and the language of pure horror begins. Until 1799, Scottish miners were slaves, not metaphorically, legally. They were serfs, bound to the mine like a chained dog to its kennel. They could be sold along with it. Go down there in your mind. There is no architecture here. Only low, narrow galleries where a grown man cannot stand upright. The air, thick with coal dust, settles in your lungs with every breath. The only sounds are the scrape of metal on stone, a muffled cough in the dark, and water dripping from the ceiling. Women worked here. They crawled on all fours through flooded tunnels, hauling huge baskets of coal on their backs, held by a strap that passed across their foreheads. Children worked here, boys and girls from the age of 5 or 6, who spent 12 hours in pitch darkness, opening and closing ventilation doors. They never saw the sun. Every pound sterling spent on Culzean's elegant facade was washed clean of their sweat and blood. Every perfectly designed window facing the sea was paid for with years of life spent in total darkness. The elegance of the oval staircase was born in the ugliness of these dark burrows. The money paid to the brilliant architect, Robert Adam, was minted from the labor of children and the despair of women. David Kennedy, a man of the Enlightenment, coolly calculated his profits in his study. To him, it wasn't evil. It was progress. It was economics. His progress, his economics. The castle's foundation wasn't laid in rock. It was clawed into human lives. And that scream, frozen in the stone, cannot be silenced even by the roar of the ocean. To understand why such a castle was needed, you must understand the man who was willing to pay any price for it. Not his own, of course, someone else's. David Kennedy was not born to rule. He was born to count. For many years, he was simply Mr. Kennedy, a lawyer, a man of numbers and paragraphs. The title of Earl of Cassillis fell to him by chance in 1775, after the death of his childless older brother. He became an earl, but in the eyes of the old aristocracy, he remained an upstart, an outsider in their club, where sharpness of mind was valued less than purity of blood. And so an obsession was born in his soul, a cold, calculating rage. He would prove them wrong. He would build something that would silence them. His legacy would be carved not in pedigree books, but in stone. He would erect a monument on the cliff, not to his lineage, but to his ego. In his youth, on his grand tour of Italy, he had seen the grandeur of Rome. He breathed the dust of ruins that had outlasted entire civilizations. There, among the wreckage of empires, he understood. True power is the ability to command not only people, but time itself. The ability to leave a mark that neither rain nor oblivion can wash away. And he needed a tool, a genius capable of turning his ambitions into stone and mortar. He found him, Robert Adam, the most fashionable, most expensive, most brilliant architect of his time. Hiring Adam wasn't just an architectural decision. It was a statement, a demonstration of power and taste. Together, they created a design steeped in brilliant duplicity. On the outside, the castle was to look like an ancient, impregnable fortress, a romantic fantasy of the Middle Ages, with towers and battlements. This was a message to the old aristocracy. My lineage is older than yours. My power is rooted in this very rock. A perfectly staged lie. But inside, Adam was to create a miracle, a neoclassical paradise, a world of light, elegance, and symmetry, the apotheosis of reason and enlightenment. This was a message to the new world. I am not a savage feudal lord. I am a modern, sophisticated man, the embodiment of progress. This is not a home. It is a theatrical set for a single actor. Every detail was designed to emphasize his status. The long, winding driveway concealed the castle until the last moment, only to then overwhelm the visitor with its full majesty. It was a calculated assault on the imagination. Outside, brute force. Inside, refined intellect. Outside, a symbol of ancient power, inherited from ancestors. Inside, a symbol of new power, earned through his own intellect and cruelty. Culzean is not a family nest. It is a self-portrait, rendered in stone. The portrait of a man who, having gained everything, feared more than anything in the world, being considered a nobody. And this rock was to become the pedestal from which his name would be seen across the centuries. Creating a masterpiece is rarely an act of pure inspiration. More often, it is war. The construction of Culzean was a war on 3 fronts, and each demanded its own blood. The first enemy was nature itself, the rock. This basalt cliff was not a reliable foundation, but a capricious beast. For centuries, Atlantic storms arriving from the west had gnawed at its base. Every tide carried away a piece of its flesh. Building here was like erecting a cathedral on the back of a slowly dying whale. The masons first had to build downwards, driving a massive seawall into the cliff to protect the future creation from the relentless fury of the waves. The wind was a constant adversary. It tore down scaffolding, broke cranes, and howled in the empty window frames, as if the very spirit of this land was protesting the invasion. The second front ran along the roads and seas. Logistics. This was an invasion of civilization at the edge of the world. Thousands of tons of sandstone had to be cut from quarries and delivered here on ox-drawn carts, along roads that barely deserved the name. The marble for the fireplaces, as white and pure as bone, made the long, perilous journey from the quarries of Carrara, all the way from Italy. It was transported on ships that could be wrecked by storms or captured by pirates. The finest craftsmen, plasterers who could create the most delicate patterns on a ceiling, wood carvers whose hands could make oak bloom, were brought in from London and Edinburgh. They traveled to this Scottish backwater for enormous sums of money, cursing the weather, the mud, and the stubbornness of the local stone. Every nail, Every pane of glass, every roll of wallpaper was the result of a titanic effort. And the third front, the most grueling, was a war of numbers, a war of money. The project, planned for a few years, stretched to 15. The budget, already huge, was bursting at the seams, bloating like a drowned man. £60,000. In today's money, over 100 million. The dream had turned into a financial black hole, sucking in revenues from evicted farmers, from coal mines, from cleared forests. Two men fought on this front. The control freak Earl, a lawyer accustomed to counting every penny, demanded reports and savings. And the genius spendthrift, Robert Adam, for whom art was above any budget. Their correspondence is a chronicle of the battle. Polite but steely letters, where the grinding of teeth is hidden behind elegant phrases. The Earl writes of exorbitant expenses. Adam replies with sketches of even more magnificent, even more expensive interiors. One tried to keep the dream within the confines of a ledger. The other knew that greatness does not tolerate compromise. This construction was not an act of creation. It was an act of violence against nature, against logic, against common sense. 300 men at its peak, masons, carpenters, laborers, battled the elements and time. Their sweat mixed with the lime mortar. Their calloused hands gave form to cold stone. They were building a paradise they were never destined to enter. They were erecting a monument to another's ambitions, unaware that time had already begun its invisible work, laying the first cracks in its perfect facade. 1792. The last master plasterer gathered his tools. The final layer of wax was buffed into the parquet floor. The war was over. The castle was complete. And it was perfect. Not just beautiful. Perfect. The oval staircase, Robert Adams' masterpiece, soared upwards 3 stories without touching the walls. It hovered in the streams of light pouring from the glass cupola. Everyone who stepped on its first tread felt not like they were climbing stairs, but ascending. This was architecture that had conquered gravity. The round drawing room hung directly over the cliff. Its curved windows erased the boundary between the room and the sea. Sitting in an armchair, you could watch a storm rage beneath your feet and feel like a god, soaring above the chaos in a perfect, man-made sphere of reason. The halls followed one another like stanzas in a perfectly written poem. Drawing rooms where the silk on the walls absorbed sound, creating an intimate silence for conspiracies and confessions. The library, which smelled of leather and wisdom that no one ever used. The armory, where over 1,000 pistols and swords hung on the walls in a dead, cold pattern. A collection of weapons that would never see battle. Everything was in its place. Every doorknob, every fire screen, every carpet was designed by the hand of a genius to create absolute harmony. But instead of a triumphant roar of applause, a silence settled in these halls. A deafening, gilded silence. David Kennedy, the 10th Earl of Cassillis, had gotten what he wanted. He had won. He had built his immortality from stone. But he had forgotten to build a life, a bachelor with no children. He wandered through these 40 flawless rooms in complete solitude. The echo of his footsteps was the only answer in the empty corridors. He would sit down to dinner at a huge table set for 30 guests, served by an army of invisible servants who moved through their own secret passages. He had built the perfect stage, but the play never began. There was no children's laughter, no family quarrels, no sound of women's voices. Only him, his creation, and the eternal whisper of the sea outside the window. Why does a man need 100 bedrooms if he always wakes up alone? Why does he need a ballroom if he never dances? He got his monument, but he didn't pay for it with money. He paid for it with the life he never lived. He died just 2 years after the castle was completed, 1792. He didn't even have time to enjoy his triumph. He didn't get to see the walls age or the silk fade in the sun. He left behind architectural perfection, a name inscribed in history, and crushing debts that fell upon his heirs like a curse. He built the perfect house, and that house devoured him. An inheritance. Is it a gift or a burden? For the descendants of David Kennedy, the new Marquesses of Ailsa, Culzean became both. They received a masterpiece as a gift, but a financial noose, tightened by the hand of their ambitious ancestor, was placed around their necks. The story of the castle after its creator's death is a story of slow decay, a story of how granite walls remain steadfast while human destinies crumble within. Generation after generation, the Kennedy family tried to carry this stone burden. They held balls, received guests, and maintained the illusion of aristocratic grandeur. But behind the perfect facade, the first cracks were already spreading. The fourth Marquess was a man of extremes. He spent money with the fury of someone trying to fill an inner void. Yachts, racehorses, expensive mistresses. He burned through the remains of the fortune while the castle silently watched its golden halls reflect the glitter of the last, desperate parties. Culzean was transforming from a symbol of power into an expensive toy that devoured its owners. And then came the 20th century, and the world for which this castle was built ceased to exist. 1914, the First World War. The roar of cannons from the continent reached here only as a faint echo. But the war came to these walls. The elegant drawing rooms, where ladies discussed poetry, were converted into hospital wards. The scent of wax and perfume was replaced by the smell of carbolic acid and blood. Crutches and wheelchairs appeared on the floors, polished to a mirror sheen. The castle, built to showcase life, became a refuge for those who had narrowly escaped death. For the first time in its history, it was truly needed. But this usefulness was born of the greatest tragedy. Then came the Great Depression. The economic chill seeped even through the 5-meter-thick walls. The enormous kitchens, designed for preparing feasts, grew cold. The dozens of fireplaces, each a work of art, were no longer lit. The family that owned this palace was forced to huddle in a few rooms in one wing to save on coal. They lived like poor relations in their own home. The splendor of the empty, cold halls became a daily, silent mockery of their poverty. They were prisoners of their heritage, curators of a museum in which they had no place. Every crack in the ceiling, every piece of peeling gilt, every faded thread on a tapestry was not a sign of age, but a scar. A scar from the battle the Kennedy family waged against their own home, and slowly, inevitably, they were losing that battle. The castle drained them of money, strength, and their future. It demanded sacrifices, and the family paid, until there was nothing left to pay with. 1945. The world was celebrating victory. But within the walls of Culzean Castle, its own final lost battle was being fought. An agony that had lasted a century and a half had reached its peak. The debts, accumulated over generations, now seemed trivial compared to a new enemy: inheritance taxes. After the death of the fourth Marquess, the state presented a bill that was tantamount to a death sentence. The figures on the paper were colder than the Atlantic wind. They meant the end. The family faced a choice from which there was no escape: to let the house be dismembered, like a corpse at auction, to sell off its soul piece by piece, the furniture designed by Adam, the paintings, the silver, the books, to let the roof leak and the walls crumble, until nothing was left of the grand dream but the picturesque ruins its creator had so yearned for, or to do the unthinkable, an act that, for any aristocratic family, was equivalent to betraying their ancestors, to give it away, simply give it away. The scene of the castle's handover to the National Trust for Scotland is a quiet tragedy, played out without an audience. There were no grand speeches, no handshakes for newspaper photographers. There was only the scratch of a pen on a document that canceled out centuries of ownership. This was not an act of generosity. It was a capitulation, an admission that one man's dream had become an unbearable burden for all his descendants. Imagine this moment. The last marquis living in the castle walks through its rooms. He touches the cold marble of the fireplace. He looks at the portraits of his ancestors, whose painted eyes seem to condemn him. He hears not silence, but the hum of absence, the absence of a future. This castle was built to secure the Kennedy name in eternity, and now his descendants were erasing that name from the facade with their own hands. They were saving the stone, but losing their home. They were giving away their past so that it could have a future without them. On the day the deed was signed, the Kennedy clan lost the war started by David, the 10th Earl. He had wanted to build an eternal monument to his power, but he built only a temporary shelter for his family. And now his descendants, the last exiles, were closing the door behind them. They were leaving, abandoning the castle to its ghosts, its debts, and a new, uncertain fate. It was not a farewell. It was an escape. The castle was saved. But salvation has its price. By giving away Culzean, the Kennedy family preserved its walls, but the soul of the home was lost forever. It ceased to be a home. It became an exhibit, and into its empty rooms, a new world entered. On the top floor, as a condition of the gift, an American general took up residence. Dwight D. Eisenhower, a hero of the Second World War. A man from a country without kings or earls, where aristocracy was measured not by the antiquity of one's lineage, but by the strength of one's character. His presence here, in the very heart of the Scottish nobility, was a quiet but deafening verdict of history. The old world, with its privileges born of violence, was giving way to the new. Power inherited by blood was replaced by power earned in battle. Today, crowds walk the halls of Culzean, tourists from all over the world. They pay an entrance fee to touch beauty. Guides lead them through perfect rooms, and their narrative is time's final verdict. They speak of the genius of Robert Adam, of his soaring staircase and dazzling drawing room. But they no longer remain silent about the price of this magnificence. They tell of the hundreds of farming families driven from their land to pay the first installment for this stone. They descend into imaginary coal mines and speak of the women and children whose slave labor became the black gold that turned into the gilding on the ceilings. The story visitors hear is no longer the one David Kennedy wanted to write. He dreamed of a monument to his name, his taste, his power. He wanted the world to remember him as an enlightened creator. But time is the most ruthless editor. It has written new chapters into his story, chapters about those he considered merely an expense item in his accounting ledgers. The Earl's ambitions did indeed create an eternal monument. The stone remains, but it no longer glorifies him. It testifies against him. The Creator's name has become just one line in a much more complex, honest, and cruel story. So what is a true legacy? The flawless beauty of a creation, frozen in stone? Or the honest, uncomfortable memory of the price that others paid for it? Culzean stands on its cliff, washed by waves and shrouded in mist. It no longer belongs to one man or one family. It belongs to everyone, and it asks everyone who looks upon it the same question, a question carved into every crack of its facade, echoing in every gust of wind from the sea. Was this beauty worth its price? Time has delivered its verdict, but the answer to that question is now up to us. Thus ends the story of a perfect facade, behind which hides the record of a crime. It is a tale of how time, the most ruthless judge, tears the mask from a creation, revealing its true cost. The stone remains, but its soul is changed forever. When we look at the masterpieces of the past, what should we see first? The genius of the creator, or the suffering of those left in his shadow? And whose story, in the end, proves more important? The story of the stone, or the story of the blood that paid for it? This dialogue does not end here. Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story made you think, support us with a like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue asking uncomfortable questions.